Before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank Chief Medina for being here this morning. I understand that there was an officer-involved shooting earlier today, and I'm glad to hear that the officers were injured. But I think it's a testament to how important this issue is that Chief Medina made the time to participate in this public announcement. The other person I'd like to specifically recognize is Angela Leary. She is the mother of Devin Hayborn, who was murdered earlier this year in April by an individual who this office had moved to detain under its authority to seek pretrial detention. We believed that Devin Mumford was a danger. Unfortunately, he was released. He was placed on GPS monitoring and was on GPS monitoring at the time. So I want to thank you for being here. I know how important this issue is for you, and I want you to understand how committed we are to continue to seek every bit of information that we can about how what Devin Mumford was engaged in, not only in the day of the murder, but in the weeks and months preceding that incident. We have asked and invited you here today to announce that the District Attorney's Office has taken the extraordinary step today of filing an inspection of public records complaint against the Second Judicial District Court located here in Bernalillo County. This complaint alleges, in short, that the District Court has violated the Inspection of Public Records Act by denying this office's repeated requests for GPS record data pertaining to two specific defendants. One, Devin Mumford, who is currently charged with an open count of first-degree murder, and a different individual by the name of Jesse Heidel. Both of those individuals, as I've mentioned before, were individuals that we felt needed to be detained pre-trial. We did not prevail in our motions to detain before the court. Instead, those defendants were placed on GPS monitoring, and they were subject to that monitoring when they subsequently engaged in new criminal activity, and they have both been taken back into custody for those new crimes. In the aftermath of the new arrests that were issued for Mr. Mumford and Mascadena Heidel, this office filed an inspection of public records request with the Second Judicial District Court seeking information about the GPS location data of those two individuals. Unfortunately, the custodian of records in the Second Judicial District Court denied both of those requests, and at this point has refused to turn over those records, citing both concerns about the criminal defendant's privacy and other legal arguments about why these records should not be made available to the District Attorney's Office. And so today's complaint directly addresses this question. We firmly believe that the Inspection of Public Records Act here in New Mexico is and has for many years provided a robust mechanism for public scrutiny and public accountability and transparency in the operations of government. And I think that nothing could be more central to an open and accountable government than public safety. For the last several months and probably for the better part of a year and a half, the courts have repeatedly made the case to the public that the pretrial release system that is in place adequately protects the members of this community from further harm. I think it is unfortunate that when we seek to test whether or not that is in fact true by seeking specific information about where these dangerous defendants have been, how they have been monitored or not monitored in the last few months or even years, that the court would deny those requests. The court offered to make some of these records available subject to a protective order, which would limit the ability of the District Attorney's Office, the Albuquerque Police Department, and members of the public to share and access this information. We think this is contrary to the spirit of the Inspection of Public Records Act, and it is contrary to the notion of open government. So we have filed this action today in the hope of obtaining records about these two specific individuals, but we are also submitting to the Second Judicial District Court today a preliminary inspection of public records request for a list of all currently named defendants who are subject to GPS supervision in this county. Once we obtain that list, assuming that that request itself is not denied, we will then work with our partners in law enforcement, our crime analysts, members of the crime strategies unit, detectives at the Albuquerque Police Department, hopefully the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, State Police, to see whether or not any of these individuals can be matched by their time and location to outstanding and unsolved crimes in this jurisdiction. The other thing that I would note in bringing this action is that the Second Judicial District Court has raised the fact or the claim that this is an established policy of the Second Judicial District, and it's been a long-held policy that these records remain confidential and not subject to public disclosure. We intend to try and understand how that policy was developed, who was involved in the development of that policy, and what legal basis they have for reaching that particular conclusion. I will be in contact with my colleagues and peers from across the state to seek to understand whether or not this particular policy is in effect only in Bernalillo County, or if there are different rules governing the public disclosure of GPS records for dangerous defendants that vary from one county and jurisdiction to the next. I, at this point, do not know whether or not similar requests in Santa Fe County and Doña Ana County and Chavez County, for example, would be honored by the courts in those respective jurisdictions. And if it is true that the Second Judicial District has developed a policy that is not squarely in alignment with the procedures and practices of other courts and jurisdictions, then I would invite the participation of the administrative office of the courts, the Supreme Court, in its use of superintending control over all inferior courts in this state to develop streamlined, uniform policies and procedures to provide maximum accountability and transparency about the GPS location data for all defendants who have been released subject to a motion for their pretrial detention. As I said at the outset, am proud to have the support of the Albuquerque Police Department and Chief Medina. And so at this time, I'd invite him to take the podium and address anything he'd like.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to recognize is that we've been very vocal about taking ownership and making changes within the criminal justice system. As Chief of Police of the Albuquerque Police Department, when I took over as interim chief, I had a conversation with DA Torrez, and I recognized I had to improve the quality of our investigations. And it actually goes beyond that. It goes back to when I came back as chief of the field, and he made me aware of the fact that a lot of cases are getting dismissed for lack of discovery, and we created a shield unit. And by us accepting the feedback from the DA, we doubled our indictment rate for cases that are coming to the DA's office. And this program was flagged as a success by a legislative committee. And they recognized that this was an important step forward for us in fixing processes. And the thing I'm going to describe now is how this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about helping the process, because this process that is broken, that has partially been fixed, affects every single aspect of the criminal justice system. Let's first start at the courts. We have judges who, when this program was implemented, were in the belief that people would be under house arrest, monitored, and they put people on GPS programs thinking that they were safeguarding the community by taking these steps. Then you have a district attorney's office who has another homicide case. We're all short resources. We're all looking to become more efficient, and who has several cases coming up. In one case, 88 burglaries. I still wonder how many others I'll discover when I get the GPS information and we overlay it with the technology that the city of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, the mayor, the council, everybody has invested in our technology. And we'd love to be able to use that technology to see where this person has been and what other burglaries they committed. Because I promise you one thing, we caught them for one crime, but they were others. Then you look down to the level of the Albuquerque Police Department. The Albuquerque Police Department is affected by officers being involved in a foot chase with Devin Mumford the next day after a homicide, or 2 days after a homicide. I'm thankful that I didn't respond that day to another officer-involved shooting. We have another use of force investigation. We have homicide investigation. We have a shooting investigation for the elderly woman that he threatened. And it's just this big chain reaction of work from one individual, and we don't even have a full snapshot of what this individual was involved in. But beyond that, the citizens of the city of Albuquerque have another homicide to their number, more frustrations for the community. But the one thing we can't forget is we now have a mother that doesn't have a son because we have a failed system, because the system isn't communicating and working with one another. A policy is a policy. Policymakers within establishments have the right to change policies. As chief of police, I change policies all the time to meet the needs of the community. We need the courts to step up. We need them to change policies. We need them to be open, transparent, just as you expect from the prosecution and from the police department. So we will continue to advocate that we get information from those individuals that are out to ensure that they're properly monitored, because the Albuquerque Police Department has invested, along with the city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico, in technology so that we could look and see where crime is being committed and if these individuals are truly keeping their word. You know, the last thing I want to say is when somebody goes to jail, they lose a lot of their privacy rights, tons of them. GPS is in lieu of jail. So how do you gain rights? By being given more privilege and benefits than sitting in jail. So I think a lot of people really have to sit back. They have to look at the decisions that are being made, and they have to recognize that we have to work together and we have to make changes to this system so our citizens can live in a safe environment. I thank the DA for helping take this initiative. I'm hoping we could receive this GPS information so that we could look to see if we could bring justice to other victims in the community that the offender of their crime has yet been able to be brought to justice. Thank you.
So with that, I would stand for any questions that you may have. Sure.
The first one for people, I hear like a little sense of frustration in the tone of their voice. Is that accurate? You feel pretty frustrated with what you're seeing or not seeing in that report?
You know, Chris, there is undoubtedly frustration by the Albuquerque Police Department in the sense that for far too long, the lens has always been upon the police department as, what are you doing wrong? What are your officers doing wrong? Why is crime high? When in reality, crime is high because we need a system that needs to be fixed. And we have some other things that are occurring in society. And, you know, as chief of police, the Albuquerque Police Department, I'm the voice of all our officers and of our community. And we have to demand change. So yes, I'm tired of meeting with grieving families. I'm tired of going to community meetings and hearing people that their house was broken into, their car was stolen. I want this system to work so that we can make Albuquerque safe for the people of Albuquerque, because they deserve it. And if that means that we have to start asking the public to hold other entities accountable, so be it. But it's imperative that I have the courage, the DA have the courage to point out to where we need to fix processes. It's not easy for me to admit where we have to fix processes, but everybody else is going to have that same idea of fixing their processes in order for this to succeed. And I hope I was able to really explain how this just doesn't affect the Albuquerque Police Department. It affects the DA's office. It affects the judges trying to do their jobs. Everybody's trying to do their jobs. And when we have a broken process, it's imperative that we fix it so it doesn't negatively affect everybody in the system.
Yeah, just a question for you. I mentioned earlier that this was an extraordinary step. Can you explain to the public how unusual it is for a prosecutor to sue the court in which you're prosecuting cases every day?
So I'm not personally aware of any other district attorney in this state having to take this step where we have had to file a formal action, a civil action, to obtain these types of records. Anecdotally, when I talk to my colleagues around the state, what I more often than not hear is that when a request comes in from the district attorney's office, or a request comes in specifically from law enforcement about particular information, that information is just provided. And I think that goes to the novelty of the justifications that the Second Judicial District Court has crafted in denying these types of requests. They have advanced the argument that a criminal defendant under GPS supervision has, I guess, some expectation of privacy. And what we've tried to point out in the complaint is that someone on GPS supervision is afforded conditional liberty in lieu of being held in the detention center. But that does not give them some claim that their whereabouts should not be monitored and tracked. I mean, after all, it was the court itself that said you were going to be under 24/7 supervision. But it goes beyond just the needs of law enforcement. It actually goes to the public, members of the media, members of the public. I think we all have a right to know where these defendants have been. And if the argument keeps getting made that this system is working, then why not give us the records? Why not give us the records? Give us all the records. And we will take those records and we will map out where these individuals have been. Chief Medina will be able to look at where are all the unsolved shootings, robberies, residential burglaries. And we'll see, we'll find out if any of these individuals have been either connected to some of those crimes or just violating the basic parameters of their supervision. And I think that the chief raised a really important point. I think the judges themselves had this assumption that when they ordered GPS monitoring, it was actually monitoring. Thankfully, some reporting that was done by your station and others revealed the fact that there was no monitoring after hours and on weekends. So that begs the question of what were all these individuals doing all of these years on nights and weekends that we don't know about? What other things were they engaged in? And the public has a right to know that. Law enforcement has a right to know that. And policymakers in Santa Fe have a right to understand that. There is, and this should be abundantly clear, the Inspection of Public Records Act has very clear exceptions that shields the disclosure of very specific information. But the default setting in this state, and it's very clear from every Supreme Court case that's analyzed IPRA, is that open government and transparent government is the default. And secrecy is the exception, and that exception has to be justified. And in this instance, there is no ethical justification and there is no legal justification for shielding these records from public disclosure. And it is not the court in its capacity either as judges or as administrators in that court to supersede the judgment of the legislature. If the legislature wanted to shield these records from the Inspection of Public Records Act, they could do that. They haven't. The legislature has routinely updated IPRA over the years to carve out different types of exceptions to protect different categories of information. It is completely silent on this. And so I think it's a relatively straightforward argument. And it's unfortunate. We tried multiple times. We tried informally. We issued subpoenas. The subpoenas were denied. The requests were denied. We find ourselves at this impasse, and I think this is, frankly, the only way for us to address it. Now, there is something that is going to be very interesting and complicating in this whole process, and that's the fact that we are filing this action in the court that we are also suing. So that's going to beg the question of who is going to be in a position to fairly and impartially evaluate this claim, because if it is true that the members of the Second Judicial District and the individual judges voted in favor of this rule of secrecy, then I think one of the things we're going to be seeking right away is an order from the Supreme Court or some other authority that takes this out of the hands of a local judge and asks a judge in a different jurisdiction or a pro-tem judge to evaluate this question, because that's what's really unique about this. Is usually judges aren't the defendants in a civil case like this.
You know, just to add one thing to that, Chris, I think it's important to remember that, you know, in order to improve, you have to always consistently be evaluated. And I think we do a great job. Me and Dave, we meet, we talk, we consistently evaluate and say, hey, how can we make criminal investigations better? You know, if the courts did have this policy as it started and things have evolved and times have changed, that's where our systems start to fail, is when individuals are unwilling, or leadership is unwilling to be courageous enough to say it's time to change. And we need to make these changes in order for us to benefit. So I think that all the systems in general need to become really fluid and understand that what you're doing today, the expectations tomorrow, or occurrences outside of your control, may require for you to make changes to your processes in order for them to continue to meet the needs of the community.
What other questions can we have?
Yeah. So I'm with KRQ News Channel 13. My name is George. So what does it mean for like the people of Albuquerque or Bernalillo County, as you know, the courts kind of, they go ahead and they deny the motions, and then they release Mumford and Hadel, and then they go ahead and commit these crimes. So what does that mean for the safety of the people of Bernalillo County?
Well, what it means, I think, in terms of public safety, is that there are individuals that we have asked be kept behind bars. Those individuals have not been kept behind bars. They have instead been placed on GPS monitoring. And we don't know whether or not that GPS is effective across the entire system. I think pretty clearly it wasn't effective in protecting the safety of the community with respect to those two specific defendants. The question now is, what else were they doing? What else were they doing before they finally got caught? What are all the other defendants doing? Where have all the other defendants been? I think we probably would be in a different position if we didn't recently learn that they weren't actually being monitored 24/7. And I think that was a revelation not only to us, to the chief, to members of the public, but frankly, to the judges who were ordering GPS monitoring. I think it was a disservice to those judges because they relied on this notion that someone was actually paying attention. Well, now that we know that that wasn't the case and hasn't been the case, I think, for several years, I think we have an obligation as law enforcement leaders and members of the community to go back and figure out, number one, were they engaged in new criminal activity or other criminal activity? Are there crimes that we can solve with this information? That's number one. Number two, even if they weren't engaged in criminal activity, how much were they complying with the terms of their release? Because remember, these are the most dangerous defendants in our system. These are individuals that were charged with substantial criminal events, criminal acts, oftentimes with extensive criminal history. They're often found with weapons. One of the interesting things that we found when we looked at our data recently is that we actually lose more of our motions to detain when a firearm is present in the case. I mean, think about that for a second. More than 50% of our motions to detain that involve a firearm are denied by this court. Well, as everyone in this community knows, the most enduring problem that we have in this community is gun violence. So an obvious next step is to take those people who we think should have been in jail for committing crimes with guns, who are placed on GPS monitoring. If they are not connected to any of these shootings, then we should know that. Give us the records and we'll figure that out. And that's where this goes. But it's, again, not just law enforcement. We all have a right to know. That's what is the driving principle behind the Inspection of Public Records Act. Government in this society and in our democratic system is supposed to take place in the open. So they can be subject to public scrutiny by stakeholders. It can be evaluated by members of the public, and that legislators who are tackling these important questions, I know in the upcoming session, they have a full range of information and understanding. And the bottom line is, if it's working so well, why hide the information? We all have a right to know, and I think we should get to the bottom of it.
And one thing I'd add to that is I think that the term monitoring really has to be examined for court personnel to monitor individuals' movements is one thing, but they don't know what they're doing during the course of those movements throughout the city. The reason the Albuquerque Police Department feels so strongly that we need this data is we have the systems to be able to look to see if we see a crime trail behind the trail of these individuals moving throughout the community. And you know, to be quite honest, you know, a lot of these arguments, you know, I don't know if they actually pass the common citizen's sense of what is right. I would think that most citizens in Albuquerque do not see that somebody in custody has the right to complete privacy of where they're at from those that are sworn to protect the community. So I think it's important that we really look and recognize that, yes, we've taken a huge step in monitoring these people 24/7, but in reality, what they're monitoring isn't telling them anything about what's going on day to day. And our process will be able to say, this is the trail of chaos that has followed this person that your monitoring isn't telling you, because their monitoring is not going to tell them they just committed a burglary if they're following the rules of how they've been released. The Albuquerque Police Department has the technology to say, we have 6 burglaries in the path of where this individual has been during the times they were there. And that's going to give us a good indication that that person no longer needs to be in the community and is a continued danger to us all.
What other questions can we address?
One from the Zoom from Colleen from the Journal. Her mic is not working, so I'll read it for her.
Okay.
Any idea how long someone is out on GPS before they go to trial or their case is resolved? Is it months, years?
I think it varies. The question was, how long can someone be on GPS? It just varies based on the specific track that someone is placed on under our case management order, the local rule here, which sets out the timelines. So we've had individuals who have been on monitoring for, you know, just a few months before they go to trial. We also have had individuals that have been on monitoring, you know, for more than a year. And so it just varies based on the calendaring that's established by the district court. Are there any other questions we can address? Nope.
Just how do you continue to get around like the denial of those requests? Like, are there any other options, kind of courses of action at your disposal?
Well, sure. I mean, this is a process where you know, we have tried different avenues asking for information. We have issued subpoenas for the records. We recently had a motion for the enforcement of that subpoena. We had that denied by a district court judge. That judge quashed the subpoena. There were some technical aspects of whether or not I think the judge was concerned whether the subpoena made sense given the context of how it was issued. But like I said, in other jurisdictions, I think it is as straightforward as a phone call to other individuals. I know one of the troubling aspects in all of this, and I think this happened in the Mumford case, is number one, when law enforcement made contact with pretrial services, it did so after hours and was not able to actually connect with anyone. I think that's hopefully been solved with the new program that's been rolled out by the district court. But second, there is, and it's included in the policy, this expectation that law enforcement obtain a search warrant before it can access specific information. That's not supported in jurisprudence in this state or any other state for anyone who is under pretrial supervision subject to GPS monitoring. And that's because there has to be an expectation of privacy. And if a judge has ordered you to wear a GPS monitor 24/7 and told you we are going to be monitoring you 24/7, you obviously have no expectation of privacy. And so there is no case that I'm aware of in this state or in any jurisdiction that would justify that. And what's interesting about all of this is the court's contention that this is a long-held policy. I actually didn't receive a copy of this policy until we started asking for the information. That was the first time that we were informed that it was a long-held and established policy that they would provide these records. And I think it's going to take a court to really dig into these legal questions and these legal issues. I think it's unfortunate that we had to do this to obtain what I think is very basic information. But my hope is that it will, again, focus the attention of the public and policymakers and law enforcement stakeholders on whether and to what extent this system is actually protecting the public. And so that's the ultimate goal. We will see what comes of it now that this lawsuit has been filed.
You know, and just with that, the last thing I'll say in closing, you know, I think it's important to recognize that we talked about how a GPS is in lieu of incarceration. Just imagine if we forced our corrections officers to get warrants every time they wanted to search somebody's jail cell. We don't require that. So why are we putting that burden upon the Albuquerque Police Department? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your participation.